Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to talk with you about transition to adulthood for youth with disabilities. I have to start by saying this is what I do. This is what I've been doing since about 1990, is thinking about what happens to kids with disabilities when they leave our special education system. You know, we invest 12 years and sometimes 15 years of special education services, but then I've always wondered, so what's next? So I've been thinking about this, I've been writing about this, I've developed some programs in collaboration with schools and communities, and I've also been studying what are the factors that really influence post-school outcomes. So for tonight, I'm going to do two things in the time I have with you. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the federal level picture. What does that mean when we talk about transition? What do we know about transition across the country for students with disabilities? And then I'm going to narrow down and talk about a specific study that I've had following up young adults with disabilities about 7 to 10 years after high school. And so we can answer a little bit of that question about what happens next. So let me start with just some legislation. Those of you that are parents are probably very familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, if you know what that is. It was passed in 1990, and for the first time in 1990, we actually had transition legislated. So this law says that if you're a student on an IEP, an individual education plan, and you're 16 years old, you also need to have transition services included in your IEP. And those need to be based on the child. It's not like there's a standard curriculum for transition. It needs to be about that individual. What do they like to do? What are their strengths and preferences? And it could include a number of different kinds of instruction. Transition isn't something that always just happens in a classroom. It could happen in a community. You could be learning to ride the bus. You could be doing job applications. So there's typically a set of transition services and some goals where parents and teachers together identify this is the outcome we want after school, and then there's steps to get there. So that's what the law says, that every child needs to have a transition plan starting at 16. And again, this has been in place almost 30 years now. So 28 years we are since this law came into place. So what I want to show you now is, first I'll tell you, we've made a lot of progress. Okay, I was around in 1990. I know what employment looked like at that time for young adults with disabilities, and it looks a lot different now. But we still have gaps. And what I'm showing you here is national data from the US Census Bureau. The piece on the left is about high school graduation. So that's kind of one of the indicators of, post-school opportunities, is if you have a high school diploma. And what you'll see on the left is the general population of young adults. About 58% are getting a high school diploma. Then you move down to the pink, which is all students with all disabilities, and that number drops to 48. And if you go a little further, those are individuals with cognitive disabilities. So then you'll see even less likely to get a high school diploma. What's especially concerning to me, though, is the other side where you see the larger gap. What you're looking at there is employment, and that's employment at any time between the ages of 22 and 30. You'll see the blue line, that's the general population, about 75% likely to get some kind of a job. Then it drops, 41% if you have a disability and 34% if you have a cognitive disability. So you can see we have these discrepancies between disabled and non-disabled youth still, even though we have this law. The other thing I want to show you is enrollment in post-secondary education. Another indicator and often a pathway to higher wage employment is to have access to post-secondary education. And what we're seeing here is, again, a lot of gains, a lot more students with disabilities entering higher education and entering vocational training, but you see differences, okay? So on your far left, that is a 2-year community college, and again, the blue is your general population, and the purple is any student with a disability. So students with disabilities are much more likely to go to a 2-year community college. The middle bar is a vocational school. Again, students with disabilities more likely to go to a trade type of school. And then finally, you're seeing a 4-year institution, and then it flips, right? You see much more students without disabilities that are going on to a 4-year university, which again, greater access to potential employment there. That comes from a national study out of Stanford Research Institute. It's about 16,000 students with disabilities that they've been following. Then the other thing I want to mention about national data is that I've been giving you these broad trends for students with disabilities, but if you dig a little deeper into the data and you want to look at differences within that group of students with disabilities, I've been really interested in thinking about, well, what about race and ethnicity? What about low-income families? What about gender? And we also see within the group of students with disabilities that we have gaps there too. So young women are less likely to be employed than young men with the same disabilities. Students who are growing up in low-income families, less likely to go to college. And then youth of color, less likely to go to college or be employed. Again, compared to disabled peers who are white. So those are gaps that I've been thinking about and concerned about and trying to understand, well, what affects that, right? Why do we have these discrepancies still between non-disabled and disabled individuals, and why do we have further discrepancies depending on your gender or racial identity? So I have a study that I'm going to tell you just a little bit about. It was funded by the U.S. Department of Education, the Office of Special Education Programs, from 2000 to about 2008. So it's a little ways back, but I feel like the findings are still very relevant to us today. And some of the findings I'll share with you have been confirmed by more recent research. So I want to describe this to you. I initially got this funding because I was very interested in this gender gap difference, right? Why is it that females look different than males when they go to the same school, they have the same family background, and what's going on there? So that was the beginning of my study, was to make a point about what are gender differences, but it turned out to be a lot more than that, to really understand what's going on for lots of different kinds of kids with lots of different kinds of disabilities. So this is the model for the study. I always like to tell my graduate students, don't be afraid of conceptual models. All they really are is a picture of what you're trying to learn, right? So you see an arrow there, and what that arrow is telling you is I was interested in this idea of what happens after school. What's the post-school adjustment? What are the employment outcomes of youth with disabilities? And I thought that it would be influenced by these three big factors, right? I think it's influenced by who you are as an individual, what is your race, what is your disability, et cetera. It's influenced by who your family is, and then it's influenced by what happens to you in school, what kind of services and supports do you get in school, and then what goes on after school. You know, some young adults are going on and getting services from a developmental disability agency or a rehabilitation agency, so I wanted to understand that whole picture. So the study allowed us to follow up young people with disabilities from the time they left high school up to about 7 to 10 years beyond high school. So I could really look at the whole picture. What we did was called a longitudinal case study design. What that means is over time, we were looking at a small number of young adults, but we were collecting a lot of data. That's what case study implies, is that you're getting lots and lots of information on a smaller sample. So there were 33 young adults in our study, all in Oregon. That's where I was living and working at the time. But we did 233 interviews over about 4 to 5 year period. So you'll see that there's a lot of depth here. I can't go into all the depth, but if you're interested, I've written a lot of articles from those 233 interviews. So who was included in the study? These young adults had a documented disability. They either had an IEP or they had a 504 plan, which allowed them to get accommodations during school. They were roughly divided into 3 groups: those with learning disabilities, those with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and then those with physical disabilities. And they all participated in a transition program in high school. In a way, that was kind of like a control for me, so I wanted to know they were all in the same program, but we had lots of different kinds of outcomes. And it happened to be a program that I was running in Oregon, so I had access to these students, okay? So we know that they got transition planning, and they got other kinds of supports while they were still in school. So I mentioned we collected the data through interviews. We interviewed the young adults, their family members, their teachers, their employers, and we also looked at records. We were interested in knowing exactly what did their IEPs say, and did this match up with that. We did a family background questionnaire, and then we also did home visits, which we learned a lot. It's one thing to talk to a parent, but it's another thing to come to their home and sort of see what's it like with the siblings, what else is going on there. So what did we learn? I'm going to summarize this for you. After 233 interviews and 5 years, it's one slide, right? So what the one slide is telling you is really focused primarily on the employment outcome. And there's really good news and bad news here. The good news is we saw a lot of employment. Almost every single one of those 33 young adults was employed at some point during those 7 to 10 years. That's the good news. And when we did their final interview, when they were aged 25 to 29 or so, they were employed in these ways. So more than half of them were working in what I would call low-wage service industry occupations. So again, good news and bad news, right? They're working, they're in the community, that's a good thing, but they're primarily working at things like food service and childcare and housekeeping and laundry and sort of very, very much service occupations. About half of them are in that category. Then another quarter were in what I call living wage occupations. And there's a definition for that. Living wage means that you're earning enough money that you don't have to rely on outside government assistance. So you're able to support yourself with housing and food and all the other things you might need. Then we had another small group that was either unemployed or what I'd call unstable. So they worked a little bit and then they were out of the workforce. They were having more challenges. But that was only about a quarter of the sample. And again, even those individuals worked at some point during the time that we were interviewing them. So of those three groups, what I was really interested in is what happened with those that went on to these living wage occupations? What was the difference? And so I narrowed it down and said, I just want to focus on those. There were 8 in our sample, and they were 25 to 29 years old when we interviewed them. And I wanted to see what got them there versus the ones that were either not employed or that were employed in low wage occupations. So this is just a little bit about their wages only. It doesn't tell you the whole story of them. This is a really interesting group of young adults. A couple of them had physical disabilities. The majority of them had learning disabilities. And you can see when we interviewed them, they were earning annual wages for an individual between $20,000 and $35,000 a year. At the time we collect the data, living wage was defined as $17,000 a year. So they're above living wage. The poverty line was about $10,000 a year. So you can see they're almost double above the poverty line. What we saw, though, with the rest of the group is that they were earning less than $10,000 a year. So this is really a unique group that fell into these living wage occupations, and it was a variety of occupations. You'll see everything from auto body technician to working in an office, one person was a case manager for adults with disabilities. So you have a whole range of occupations. But what led them there, right? That's what I wanted to know. What led them there? There's 2 pieces I want to tell you about. One is that when they left high school, they were engaged in something. And that means they were either working or going to school or a combination of those 2 things. That was really important to their future success, that they got connected to something right when they left school. And what led them to that engagement was these 3 big ideas. They had some kind of work experience while they're still doing in school. That's really important. They had between 5 and 10 jobs while they were in high school. So they got lots of experience learning what it means to work. They got transition services, which means they had a transition plan, they had somebody working with them, they had people that would help them apply to college if they wanted to go to college. So they got that support during high school. Again, not waiting until the very last minute and trying to do a transition plan when you're a senior, but starting early. And then also, I think this will be confirming to those of you who are parents, family support really mattered. Families had high expectations, and they said, I believe my young adult should work, should go to college. That was much more likely to happen. And that's confirmed in other studies as well, that family expectations matter. So that's what got them there, was initial engagement in some kind of employment or education. And then, I want to tell you this first before I go on. So this is actually a grandparent that we interviewed. She was talking about her daughter, her granddaughter, and said, well, I tell her you need to have a job, so no matter what happens in life, you can always take care of yourself. I want her to have a job that she likes, a job where she can earn a living, not live in poverty. So that grandmother was really clear that that's what she wanted her granddaughter to be able to do, is be independent. And that mattered, that expectation mattered. I want to talk to you also about the first job, because I told you that when they left high school, they were employed, and that was important. And that's a predictor in national studies. It's a predictor. Having a job when you leave high school is a predictor of later employment. But what you should also know is the first job often looked like this. It was not a high-wage job. It looked like a service job, but it was an opportunity to have a job and continue to gain skills. And so there's, again, kind of the good news and bad news about that. It's great to be employed. Sometimes being employed in service industry only leads you to further service industry jobs, and it doesn't allow you to advance. But being employed initially still is an important factor for later success. So what led them to high-wage employment? If they started at McDonald's or they started at a community college, how did they get to those living wage occupations? And there was really 3 things there. One was post-secondary education. And it didn't matter what type. Some of them got a bachelor's degree, some of them went to a community college, one of them did an auto tech kind of program. One of them did short-term training with their employer, but some kind of training that could build their skills. They also stayed in the workforce, so during that 7 to 10 year period when we followed them, they continued to work steadily. And here's where we saw some gender differences. The men were actually much more likely to have stable employment. We counted the number of months that they could have worked, and the men were like 90 to 95% of the time working, whereas the females were more like about 30 to 70%, so a little less stability, more in and out of the workforce for health reasons or family reasons. But they all worked, and being in the workforce allowed them to have future opportunities. So the guy that was at the auto body shop started off, as a part-time assistant, and 7 years later, he's managing the auto body shop because he's been there, right? And he's learned it, and he's done it hands-on. So the thing you don't see on this slide is the third factor, and that is personal qualities, which I called motivation, persistence. People now might call it grit. You might have heard that talked about in education. Back then I called it persistence, but it was that idea that they didn't give up. They might have got a job and lost it. They might have had struggles while they were in college, but they were very much committed to wanting to continue employment. So that led to career advancement, and that was important. This is one of the young adults in our study who was talking about her experience learning how to be a heavy equipment operator, which is a non-traditional job for a female, but led her to a high-income occupation. And she said, "The classes have helped me quite a bit because every single job I've had in this field requires these abilities. The more tools I have in my toolbox, the more valuable I am." So she understood that value of continuing to gain skills, and it allowed her to advance in her career. Let me wrap up by showing you this. This is a summary, really, of the big things that we found when we think about transition to employment and what makes a difference. And again, I was especially interested in this idea of living wage. Can somebody be independent and not be economically dependent, have more opportunities? These were the things that made a difference that I found in this study, which are confirmed by a lot of other research. So we really found 3 things were important during high school. It was about work experience, getting experience in jobs, it was about transition services, and it was about family expectations. Those 3 things led to this idea that right after high school, you're engaged. You're working, you're going to school, you're doing some combination of those things. And then when you follow it out over time, you'll see that there's 3 other things that mattered. And that was post-secondary education, whatever format. It didn't have to be a college degree, it could be lots of different ways. This idea of continuing to work provided advances. And then finally, the idea of personal attributes and what are the things that we can teach those things, right? Those are malleable. We can teach kids to have self-determination and make good decisions. Those led, at least in this study, those led to living wage employment, and they led to greater satisfaction and greater independence as adults. My last thing that I'd like to say in kind of thinking about what does that mean when I think about the studies that we've done and what we've learned over time, I think it's really important to think about transition as a process. Sometimes we think about it, it's a one decision, right? You leave high school, you make a decision, you're done. It doesn't work quite that way. It's much more chaotic, it's up and down, and it starts early and it extends into young adulthood. So think about this as a process that will unfold over time. The other thing I'd like you to think about is transition is not an independent activity. I know we always talk about having our young adults be independent, but really it's interdependent. You need to have schools involved, you need to have families involved, you need to have employers involved, and when those systems work well together, that's when we really see successful transition outcomes. Thank you very much.
My name is Steve Ritter. I'm staff here at the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. One of the things that I do is work with families and people with disabilities to understand both transition as well as the services that will support them in adulthood. And the topic that I'm talking about tonight, we need to understand when we talk about transition, that transition is actually set up in 2 different stages. There's high school transition services, but then there's also what we call post-secondary transition services. And post-secondary transition services happen after high school. If a student with an IEP does not graduate from high school, then they have the option. It is an optional service that is provided to people from the age of 18 through the end of the school year after they turn 22. So in the work that I've done with families, I've really seen that they struggle with understanding what post-secondary transition services are and how that can be a valuable part of getting people ready for adult life. As Lauren mentioned, the transition is something that needs to happen as a long process. It cannot simply be that you make a plan the final months as someone is 22. So we need to make sure that we're working in a very thoughtful way. Transition services really need to be goal-driven. The idea of transition services is to really help people envision, what is my life going to be like as an adult? What are the things that I want to do? Where will I work? Where will I live? Will I be going to post-secondary education, if that's community college or a vocational program? And so people need to really be exposed to the possibilities of what's out there. They also need to, as you do that, then you could identify what does the person need to learn to make those things realistic. What opportunities exist within the period while people are in transition? Transition is very different than in high school. In high school, there's a very big focus on graduation requirements, specific course requirements that someone needs to do. And it happens a lot within the classroom, whereas transition can really happen a lot outside of the classroom to make functional activities as the person is riding a bus, as the person is volunteering. So it's an opportunity for people to do a lot of work outside of the classroom and get those experiences. And finally, as Lauren mentioned, people with disabilities will oftentimes rely on services. And so learning about those services and, as I so much appreciate you mentioning, applying for those services, because most services that serve people with adults are, first of all, very complex to apply for. And second of all, they're oftentimes impacted and they may not be able to serve the person for a year and up to 2 years after you apply for the services. And so if you don't do that work in advance, and if you don't explore those services, then you're asking parents and family members to navigate a very difficult system to learn what services that person's even eligible for, to successfully complete the application, and then wait until that service can actually serve the person. So working as part of the transition, making that work be part of the transition and not just focusing on in-class work is a very important aspect of a successful transition process. Post-secondary transition services really focus in on 3 areas. The first area is education and training. And in education and training, it's all transition services need to be based on age-appropriate, real assessment tools. And those will provide, first of all, a baseline of where the person's skills are, but also it will allow the student to understand what they need to accomplish to meet the areas that they are interested in engaging with as an adult. Again, as compared to high school, there's a lot of opportunities during post-secondary transition for people to spend a lot of time engaging in real-world activities so that they can learn skills and practice skills in a very functional kind of way. I always say that in transition, we understand that we have someone for 4 years, from the age of 18 to 22. The question is, are we identifying the skills that we're working on and saying, will this person be able to learn this in a functional way that they can apply in adulthood? And if not, what kinds of technology can we introduce or other kind of adaptive routines can we introduce so that the person can meet their needs so that we're not simply teaching educational skills over and over and over again. If a person is struggling with money identification, or if the person is doing rote kinds of copying of the alphabet, then that's really not going to be a functional use to them as adults. We have amazing technologies that we carry in our phones that if a person is struggling with reading, we have amazing text-to-speech that we can be teaching people, which is much more functional. than simply having people copy. We can also use speech to text. There's money identification. There's all kinds of technology and other kinds of ways that we can teach people to do the things that they're going to need to do as adults. For some people, as Lauren mentioned, for some people, what they will be doing after high school or after a post-secondary transition is going to a college. Some students in post-secondary transition are actually attending a college class as part of their post-secondary transition program. So they're actually attending that. It's an opportunity for them to, first of all, see if it's a fit, to learn the services that exist through DSPSs, disabled student programs that exist on college. So there's all kinds of things that can be practiced by making part of your transition experience actually going to a college, if that's something that's going to be, if that's going to be a part of what you do after you exit transition. Again, one of the things that needs to happen is if that's going to be the goal for someone to attend a community college or any UC or a CSU, is you can spend part of that transition process of applying for that before you leave transition. You do not want to just put that off. Employment is the second area that transition services apply for. Again, it's assessment-based. The assessments range initially from just basically what's available that the person may be interested in, and then it can winnow down into the areas of what skills need to be mastered in order to be successful within that. So assessments are a very important part of that. And again, part of what can happen in transition is in-class kinds of work, developing resumes, other kinds of in-class kind of work. But it can also be used to volunteer as part of the transition day. It can be spent in volunteering or in paid internships. And we recently have, in California, developed some paid internship opportunities for people in transition. And that's a very, very important indicator for people being able to be employed afterwards. Learning about the support systems that exist for people and those support systems that are specifically eligible for each student is something that's very important. You can do that by attending as part of the outings that happened during transition, your transition day. You can go to different sites to see the types of services that exist and the services that they provide to see if there's something that you're matched with. You can also have, and I think it's not that you can, you should also have representatives involved in all team meetings. So if you are someone who's going to be accessing Department of Rehabilitation Services, they should be at the team meetings so that they can, first of all, verify that you're going to be eligible. But it can also inform the team on what kinds of skills that they should be addressing during transition so that you will be successful when you go to the services. If you're someone who is going to be, who is eligible for regional center services, the regional center service coordinator should be there. And again, they will assist the families with knowing the options that are available and also the kinds of things that the team should be working towards to make that a successful possibility. And I'm going to just, every slide is going to end with the same refrain. You need to make part of the transition process an actual application so that you're not waiting and unengaged for the first year after you exit transition. There is, as I'm sure Marjorie will talk about following this, when people are unengaged or disengaged from structured routines, then they develop bad habits. They become very anxious about whether or not they're going to be able to successfully do things later on. And so we want people to have a seamless transition. Transition should be prepping, and it should be a seamless process so that when you exit transition, you actually start your adulthood, your adult life as soon as you exit. The last area of transition services is actually optional, which I don't understand, why anyone would choose not to include independent living focus within transition. Regardless of if a person is interested in moving away immediately from not living with the family anymore after they leave high school, the idea that you would want to start to develop the skills so that you could be more independent within your house. But for a lot of people, they do have an interest in living away, and the reality is at some point, almost everyone is away from family. And so you're going to want to include your independent living skills within transition as well. Again, there's a lot of work that can be done in the classroom regarding just in-class kind of work. But in addition to that, most transition classes have a laundry and a kitchen within the transition class, so people can start to develop those practical skills. And regarding services for people in the area of independent living, for people who don't qualify for regional center services, each county has a independent living center that is funded by the Department of Rehabilitation that is good for the families. If they don't receive regional center services, it's good for families to get exposed to those services so that you know what they offer, and again, not only know about them, but actually participate with some of their work so that you're familiar with that environment and they're familiar with you as well. For people who do receive regional center services, the broad range of services that are available. Almost all families are aware of group homes that the regional center funds. Many families are not aware that there's also supportive living environments that, regardless of the level of support needs that someone has, that they can go and live in their own apartment with additional supports through supported living services. So again, it's important for families to have the full explanation of services that they're eligible for. And I'm going to just do the refrain. It's important to apply for those services early. For supported living or even group homes, those oftentimes have a year to 2 years waiting list. And so if you don't apply early, they're not going to happen. There will be a very large gap. I just want to say that it's important to understand, and this part is really just focused on people who have regional center services. Many families who have children in high school don't understand the fact that regional center services during high school are by law restricted. The regional center is the payer of last resort. And so while a person is eligible for school, the regional centers cannot pay for things that the schools can provide. So when a person either ages out of school at the age of 22, or if they receive a diploma, then at that point the regional center can kick into the full level of services that they can provide. It's important to recognize that a certificate of completion is not a diploma. And I've known some families who are very shocked because they believe that their son or daughter is now eligible for a regional center because they've gotten a certificate of completion. And then they're very shocked to find out that, in fact, that they're not going to receive services until they're 22. So that's very important. Again, with people who are regional center eligible, I have met a number of families who their son or daughter was graduation tracked, was eligible to be on the graduation track, and it was recommended to them that they not receive a diploma so that they can take advantage of post-secondary transition services. Post-secondary transition services are very valuable, but it is important when you're making that decision that you visit the location, that you really understand the level of services that will be provided for the next 4 years. It's important also to consider the implications of not receiving a diploma if you could have received one. If you could receive one, it does have an impact on employment. It has an impact regarding your post-secondary education opportunities, and it also has the social and self-esteem issues that are associated with that. So it's very important that you weigh that decision very, very carefully and that you also understand that it is a 4-year commitment. If you forego the diploma, then you will not be able to receive regional center services until you're 22. So it's very important that people understand that you can't go back on that decision if it's not what you expected. And the final thing I just want to emphasize is that the regional center services cover a very broad range. There are employment services. There are services regarding where people live. Those services are very rich and very deep, and it's important to recognize that most of those services also have tiers. Within employment, there are workshops that are available. There's day programs that are available, and there are supported employment services. Many people believe that in order to qualify for the supported employment services, that you need to have the most skills. And in reality, the people who I have met who receive all 3 of those tiers of services come across the full range of ability levels. It really is which service system you're supported by is really more a matter of your preference and your comfort rather than the level of support that you require. And it's important that families advocate for the services that they want, not the services that they believe that they're eligible for. And that's, again, it's an important part of transition to really be exposed to the full range of services so that you can make an informed choice. And I just want to end one last time with the fact that you need to apply for those services early because they're all impacted. And the last thing I would ever want to see, and what I see too often, is people exiting transition and staying at home without any structure for a year or even 2, and for families to be doing the work of applying for services, which is so difficult to navigate if you don't have experience. So use that transition process to get you linked up before you leave. And I just want to end with some resources. For educators, and for families that are interested in the real details of transition on an education front, the California Transition Alliance has Secondary Transition Planning, the Basics, which I have a link for there. And that is an excellent resource regarding the specifics of transition. I love the second resource. It's written by a self-advocate in San Francisco. And it is not so much designed to know about the transition services as it is for families to think about what happens in transition, what kinds of things can we do to support people so that they can feel like they're adults, that they can assume that adult identity, and that they can make choices for themselves in adulthood. And so the second link is a really excellent site. It's also it's hosted by UCSF's site, which has a ton of other resources that may be interesting for families. So I want to thank you, and we'll turn it over to.
So I'm Marjorie Solomon. I'm a professor in Department of Psychiatry, and one of my claims to fame is that I was the postdoc who founded the Social Skills Training Group program. And as time went on, I saw more and more of the kids that I was working on. Since I'm doing this for close to 20 years, people started to become young adults, and we really started to want to try to help these individuals. So with the help of Steve Reuter and Tasha Oswald, postdoc working with me at the time, we started one program, but then adapted to another program called the Access Program. So what I'd like to do tonight is just tell you a little bit about this program, and also to let you know that we are going to be running the program again starting in June. Please see me or see Terry and put your name on a list. She's shaking her head. Yes, she'll take names if you're at all interested in this program. So I don't think I need to really tell anyone here that this is a time of a big problem. This is my tsunami slide, and there's a whole tsunami of adolescents diagnosed with autism, and they're transitioning to adulthood, and there just aren't a lot of services for them. And as Steve mentioned, one of the big problems that we're seeing in a lot of the studies coming out of the National Transitional Longitudinal Study, is that these individuals become disengaged from adult roles. So they don't find jobs, they don't develop adult social relationships, they don't find partners, they don't live independently. So in our work, we began to think that perhaps anxiety played a role. I think that every young adult transitioning faces some form of anxiety, but being an adult with developmental disabilities or with autism is this particularly daunting process. And we know that in autism, anxiety is one of the most common clinical problems that you see. And it can definitely interfere with the transition to adulthood when all these things are changing and people are feeling really uncomfortable with facing new realities. And we were inspired by the fact that research has begun to indicate that cognitive behavior therapy can be used to treat anxiety in high-functioning children and adolescents with autism. There have been a number of studies now. The trials haven't been super large, but they've had initial promising results. And in part, based on that, one of the projects in our newly funded Autism Center of Excellence grant will be using CBT with individuals with autism. So we created an intervention to increase engagement in adult roles, hopefully, by providing skills to cope with all the natural stressors that accompany the transition to adulthood, to help young adults with autism develop and maintain social relationships with their peers. We know when children with autism leave the school setting, it can be a lot more isolating, and they're not so frequently surrounded by other individuals their age. And ultimately to function in adult work and social settings by providing important information about them and also by teaching organizational skills. Another aspect of the program that I think kind of ran through as a theme in Dr. Lindstrom and Steve's presentations is that it's really important in transitioning to adulthood that young adults start to change in their relationship with their parents. Relationships really have to change to be more of mature partnerships than authoritarian kinds of relationships. And this is a hard thing to pull off. But we believe it's kind of potentially a secret weapon in helping our individuals with autism transition to adulthood and helping their parents to better help them. So in this intervention, we had everyone enroll with a social coach. For most people, that was their parent. But in some cases, it was their spouse. And in other cases, it was a caregiver. And in other cases, it was a close friend. So in the Access program, we had weekly sessions for an hour and a half for approximately 20 weeks. In each Access group, we had one leader and several co-leaders that modeled parts of the curriculum and assisted during group activities and facilitated. There were approximately 12 to 15 young adults in each group. And actually, we started out by having these facilitators be individuals here. We have a wonderful group of research assistants, postdocs, who really like to work with people with autism, and they were the initial crop of co-leaders. But as time went on, we actually had some of the successful graduates from the program who were adults with autism lead the groups, and we felt this was really a great, seamless way to get them integrated. In a typical group, we would review the last week's topic. We always assigned what we called life practice, which was sort of homework, 3 to 5 times a week. They would be asked to do some sort of an assignment with their social coach. And so we'd have them share and talk with each other about what happened in the life practice. We would cover some new materials. We'd share a snack. We would have role plays in small groups and explain the life practice for the next week. Important parts of the Access program that really differed, we tried very hard. A lot of people came back from that initial social skills program and were parts of the first groups. We tried really hard to make it seem like a much more adult experience, so they weren't coming back to social skills group again as age 22-year-olds. So we did the groups as sort of boardroom style presentations in more mature conference rooms with PowerPoint kinds of presentations. And we really worked as a group, and this is a group intervention, and we think the group is really powerful because it allowed us to help people to normalize and validate their feelings and experiences in the transition, to learn from and teach each other by sharing, to practice the actual skills they were learning in small groups, and develop close, respectful relationships and friendships. And to do this, we really made it one of the hard parts about we wanted to have men and women in the same groups, but we didn't want anyone to feel threatened by being, approached too often by someone that you were not particularly interested in as a partner. So for the first, I think it was 4 to 6 weeks of the program, we really forbade people from really calling each other and dating outside of the group, because we wanted them to have a chance to learn how to become friends first and to learn the mores of the group first. And then it was actually, we ended up not on 3 to 5, but 6 weekly life practice assignments to practice these skills. And I can't say that everybody always did all 6, but the important thing was to make it a regular experience of social coaches and participants getting together to talk about things. So let me just talk a little bit more about the role of the social coaches. We were really fortunate to have Steve Reuter lead these groups. And they really essentially received the same training as the participants. And they completed all the life practice assignments as well. They were assigned to meet with their participants 3 times a week to review and discuss the life practice. And they were supposed to be modeling, applying access techniques to their own lives. And they were also asked to help reinforce and clarify information for participants if participants had problems because they were learning the same materials. So actually both sides of the dyad could do that for each other. And assist in applying techniques to real life situations. And what we were really trying to do here was to see that there'd be a evolving relationship between coaches and participants that would be more balanced. And we also wanted to give them an opportunity to start having rich conversations with each other and to kind of break out of that parent-child or, teacher-student or caregiver-participant role, and to revise views of each other, to find new strengths and insights in themselves and about each other. We wanted to encourage more independence, and new ways of interacting with each other that were based on mutual respect, change directive kind of behaviors to more guiding behaviors, and to raise expectations, because we too have observed that having high expectations, like Dr. Lindstrom suggested, are really important. So quickly, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what the curriculum looked like. This is a schematic of the 20 lessons. The first 4, we taught foundational concepts. There, we gave group rules. We wanted to help learn about active listening. We also taught something called social circles, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. That's what that little bullseye chart is, to try to teach individuals in the group how you have to treat different people differently, so teaching perspective taking or theory of mind. And then active listening, I said, but receiving feedback. And we really believed that receiving feedback was going to be a cornerstone of the groups, because they really needed to learn how to give feedback to others and receive so that the group process would work. But if you see, those same receiving feedback and giving feedback skills are super crucially important for work environments. So we wanted to nest that at the beginning. The first lessons 5 through 11 were our CBT lessons primarily. Then we know that social relationships are so important, and disengaging from social roles related to social relationships are really critical. So we talked about the friendship social circle. We did more social skills training, in the form of talking about different types of friendships, conversational skills, and we even reviewed conversational skills because it's so important. And finally, we got into work-related matters. In some of our groups, we did mock interviews. In some, we talked about receiving feedback at work, disclosing in the work setting. And then we talked some about workplace rules and culture and how to graduation at week 20. This is the social circle diagram I told you about. We wanted people to know that they're in the orange circle, and people in the red circle, like family and best friends, are treated a lot different than strangers or your boss. And this was news to a lot of people, because we know that the amount of personal information shared, strength and nature of the relationship, and consequences of rule breaks really differ depending on where you are. We taught a lot of stress management. We taught them to understand during the CBT module their feelings, physical feelings that would cue them that they're anxious. And then we taught them about, they were a very popular thing was teaching them about thinking traps that they tended to fall into. This really resonated with people. And I think it resonated with the social coaches as well, that oftentimes we get very anxious about things and we can fall into thinking that everything is really negative, or the worst case scenario is going to happen, or that you have to be perfect, or that everything you do is going to hinge on what you do today. If you fail today, you're always going to fail. Or falling into a blame game trap where you blame other people for your own problems or yourself too much. And that those kinds of things and falling into those kinds of traps leads to avoiding. So there's where you get to the whole disengagement. You make excuses, you distract yourself with other activities, you don't do something, you hide in your office, you procrastinate, you have meltdowns, you take it out on others. We tried to make this very explicit to both the social coaches and the children, adult children, because we all do this, and it was very powerful. And then again, talking about relaxation tools to try to help them to get past some of the avoiding. And also teaching other tools like, try to say, well, what's the worst case that could happen here? What's the best case? And what's the most likely case? So just briefly, I want to take you through our study design. We were funded by the Behavioral Health Center of Excellence at UC Davis. We had 41 participants, aged 18 to 38. All of them had verbal and full-scale IQs over 70. And they were all assessed with gold standard ADOS. We randomized them into groups. We had treatment as usual, waitlist control group, that was one group. And then we had the access treatment groups. Those were two groups that were both conducted in the spring of 2016. And the treatment as usual group received services in fall of 2016. Student-staff ratio in the groups was 3-to-1. We also did a lot of fidelity checks every time to our intervention to make sure that everyone was doing the curriculum properly. A lot of our results were from the social coach reports. They reported that their participants with autism completed the intervention, had adaptive home living skill improvement, conceptual and social adaptive functioning, so they were better communicators and more self-directed, and they had better self-determination skills as a result of the group. The participants themselves reported that they had a stronger belief in their ability to access social supports in times of strength, not only from family, but from friends. And so we really concluded that this may represent a shift towards increased autonomy in the participants, which is what we'd like to see and we hope would kind of propel them to be more engaged in adult roles. These results were published. Tasha Oswald was the first author, and the rest of us were also on the publication, and that was in that took place, the publication was back in the fall, I believe. So you can find that in JAD. And I'd just like to thank everyone who's helped make this work possible, our funding sources, Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, which directly funded this. And it always takes a village. So we had wonderful co-leaders and research assistants who really helped with a lot of the data analysis. So thanks.
And looking at the factors of family expectations, support, and social peer employment engagement, what role do you see mental health providers playing? And Marjorie, you could also respond.
Yeah, that's a good question. What we actually saw when I was talking about that smaller group of students that were more unstable, we found they had more mental health challenges and physical health challenges, and so that definitely impacted their ability to be able to be independent. We didn't work specifically with mental health providers, but I'm seeing that more and more in terms of high school counselors being more aware of the kind of the intersection of health and mental health and the importance of making those connections for kids.
So since we're in a hospital-based setting, we tend to kind of come at all these things from a more mental health kind of perspective, and so that's why we focused on anxiety. In one of the studies we're doing now, we're actually looking at psychopathology in a lot of individuals going through this transition, and our working hypothesis is that the presence of psychopathology, which is so common in a lot of kids with autism, they have really high rates of anxiety and depression, ADHD, is probably going to lead to more difficulties and problems, but we don't know that yet, and I'm sure there's mitigating factors in there as well. So I think it is a big issue, though, and something that we have to keep our eyes on.
Okay, Dr. Lindstrom, why do you think the males were more successful than females in making transitions?
That's a great question. Actually, my current study is focused particularly on females with disabilities. I have a curriculum written specifically for girls with disabilities, and I think it has to do with general social barriers that exist for all women, and then that gets exacerbated when you add the disability piece on top of that. So, you know, we have a wage gap for all women. We have differential experiences for all women, and so I think what we saw, the patterns that we saw in this study are, you know, fairly typical of patterns for women in employment, whether or not you have a disability. So that's my theory after 25 years of working on this.
Thank you. So this is a question I think I understand. What resources for the population of young adults who are in the diploma track and fail or are having difficulty to regain momentum?
So for people who are struggling with the education requirements for graduation, I don't have a very good solution for that other than just the resources that exist within high school regarding making sure that students are taking advantage of every opportunity regarding the tutoring that's available and the other kinds of opportunities. And one thing I would say is that oftentimes for a lot of people, the ability to partner with peers is so significant. And I think that when people do partner with that, it not only has social implications, but it also can help people to raise their academic opportunities. A lot of times peers are able to explain things, and just being with someone who's a student who's getting it can be beneficial. I don't have any research, that I can share with you on that topic, but I have to say that would be the first thing that I would be inclined to suggest, is to make sure that people are fully engaged with the opportunities, including developing relationship with their peers.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions about a variety of different services. Accessing internships and interviewing for jobs, learning about services and systems for taking on fiscal responsibilities, learning to budget, and then sort of a question that asks about all of those is there a cheat sheet available for services to sign up for early? How much time, list of things to do?
That's a very loaded, very packed question. I would say a couple of things. The resource that I had listed, the Transition to Basics, is filled with a variety of assessments and education tools that are available to teachers, and certainly would be something that if you wanted to do some of those experiences on your own as a parent, or encourage the school to make sure that they're following those best practices, there are things that you can that if you research those, that you can be involved with those. Again, one of the things that's hard about the services that will be available to support people is it's very hard for families to know what services they will be actually eligible for. If you receive regional center supports, at that point things are a lot more codified, and you know that you receive at regional center supports that you are eligible for all of the services that the regional center would provide. If you're not eligible for regional center supports, the thing that's very difficult for families, and this is why I encourage it to be included within transition, is that each agency that supports people, that's what we call a generic agency, that's not through the regional center, each one has very different qualifications and eligibility requirements. And so it's one of the reasons why working with the transition program and making sure that they're supporting in that process is so important, because it's really unfair to ask parents to find out all that information. It's because it's a world that we don't have experience with. And so I would just encourage people to make sure that's part of the transition process. And as I said, as part of the presentation, a big part of transition should be that every team meeting, that there are those outside people from those service agencies that may be available to support you present, so that they can answer those questions about what services are available, when should we be applying so that there is a seamless transition after the program ends?
I just wanted to add something about what I believe is the value of exploration. I think part of that question was about work experience. And if you remember in the study that I conducted, those young people had 5 to 10 different kinds of jobs while they were still in high school. And oftentimes they found out what they didn't like to do. They found out what they weren't good at. That's important before you go all in on something. So if you have those opportunities, even if it's volunteering or it's part-time, it really matters to let young adults experience and also to open up possibilities. I sometimes see, very well-meaning teachers saying to a young adult, well, you don't read very well, so maybe you shouldn't go to college. We don't want to say that. We want to say, what do you want to do? And what would it take to get you there? What kind of support would you need to go to college? What kind of support would you need if you want to be a welder or a truck driver or whatever it is you want to do? So think about exploration and also think about supports that can be provided by families, by teachers, by other systems.
So that's a wonderful lead into this question is, to what extent have model systems or processes that you've described been rigorously evaluated for operational effectiveness? And a related question, what would a good program look like, or DSPS program look like for individuals with autism or with other disabilities? This person's experience was that the DSPS centers have been, their advice is let the student advocate for him or herself, which has been difficult.
Our study was an attempt to try to validate a model and to study it and show its effectiveness. It's in practice really hard to evaluate a lot of these curricula that are out there. So that's why we wanted to try to develop one and then evaluate it. But I can't say that it's the be-all and the end-all. We'll need to have larger studies and be able to replicate what we did and tinker with what we did based on what we found. So there aren't a lot of, there's not a lot of empirical research anyway on sort of more clinic-delivered mental health kinds of interventions in the young adult population. There's more for younger folks.
Regarding the DSPS programs that are in college, the questioner is accurate that the responsibility for advocacy is on a person with disability within the college system. With that said, we do have some, if the person receives regional center services, we have Futures Explored has a tremendous college support program that's available that will not only assist people who have intellectual disabilities with finding the right classes that they need to take and how to use those and stitch those together into either a certificate or some kind of useful outcome for attending college. But they will also help the student navigate the DSPS process. We also have Project Search, which is another program that's run at Sac City College. That is another program that will help people to get a certificate that will be helpful within employment. So DSPS is a very you need to take responsibility for it, which frankly is also an important lesson because you're going to need to do that when you get into your employment. You need to know how to advocate for yourself within that. But we do have, for people with intellectual disabilities, a couple of programs within Sacramento that will really assist people through the DSPS process, which is very helpful.
I'll just add one piece to that question about rigorous studies. I think we do know what works. I think there's national data that you can look at that talks about outcomes. We had a project in Oregon, over 200 high schools, over 25,000 students that participated in this transition program, and we have data to show that those youth were 75 to 85% of the time they either went to college or they went to work. So we know what works, and it's a multi-component piece. You have to have transition supports, you have to have planning, you have to have instruction that looks at vocational skills and academic and social skills, and then you have to have some kind of an adult who believes in you. And that could be a teacher, that could be a family member, but it's that combination of services, instruction, and experiences that matter. And I believe that we can document that we know what works with transition. I think we just need to do it.
So one way you can look at that research is to go to Google and do Google Scholar and put Dr. Lindstrom's name in. Okay, so I have two questions about access. Typically, at what time of day does it occur, and how does one convince your adult child to attend?
How does one convince your child to attend? Okay. The first one, we tried to make it as late as possible. It depends. Fortunately, we're grant funded before, so we could start it at 6:30 because we didn't have to have folks come to the desk here to pay. But this year will be conducted on a fee-for-service basis, so we push it as far to the end of the day while we still have staff here because we know some people are working. So this year, I believe it's going to, in June, it'll start at about 4:30, which isn't ideal, but that's what we have to do. How do you convince your child to attend? Well, we can put them in touch with other people who've participated in the program and may have some things that they could tell them to make them feel more relaxed about it. We have, we're always available to talk to folks, and we sometimes start with the try it, and if you don't like it, you can leave kind of strategy. And generally, we find that being with a group of peers, it's a fun kind of a group. It's lighthearted, and people talk a lot and laugh a lot. And we find that usually people don't leave once we've gotten them to walk through the door the first time. But we do know that that can be a problem.
Okay, so this is a question about a child who is placed in a school district, in a private school that's different from the home district, which generates the IEP, but the dollars to support that are in the district where his school is. So the question would be, who is responsible for generating and overseeing transitional services?
And I'll be honest, that is a question that I do not have the information to confidently answer that question. My work has been, again, on explaining and making sure that families understand transition. For that kind of information, I would really encourage people to contact the school district to really work through that process. If push comes to shove, Disability Rights California may be an appropriate resource to find out more information about that, or even the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. But it's really not something that I have the expertise that I can answer that.
Okay, I have one more question about what kinds of living options are available for teenagers, young adults who have minimal life skills and occasional aggressive behaviors, and how would you look for those resources? So,
again, this is kind of a difficult question to answer. It really depends on if the person receives regional center supports or not. I wish I could say that everybody who had complex needs was eligible for regional center, but that's not the case. I would encourage families that were told when their sons and daughters were young that they did not meet regional center eligibility to reapply, because what we have seen over the past couple of years is that there have been changes in eligibility requirements, and also that some of the eligibility requirements for being eligible for regional center are things that will not be evident when a person is young, but if they don't have adaptive skills that are needed for adulthood, that they may be at this point eligible when they were younger. But regarding if the person does receive regional center services, and again, one of the misconceptions that exist is that there's kind of a tiered system, that people who have high support needs can only be eligible for group homes, and that people who have less support needs can be in independent living or supported living. And as I said before, in reality, when I visit people and know people who have disabilities, I see some very challenging people living in their apartment with support needs, and some with support in what we call supported living. I actually have seen some situations to where there are 2 support staff that are with the person 24 hours a day. It doesn't happen very often, but there have been cases where that's been the case. So the reality is that there is a spectrum of services that are available, and it's really based more on the preferences, the comfort level, and how much advocacy that families are going to put into getting one service over another. If the person does not receive his regional center support needs, then you do have to rely on generic services, which will be in-home support services, and will also be, again, the independent living centers that are funded by the Department of Rehabilitation. The thing I'd say about the independent living centers through the Department of Rehabilitation is that they do not come to anyone's house. Those are services that you will go to that center and receive some guidance, but it will not be directly coming and assisting you with developing a budget and managing things within your home. So it's one of the reasons why I do encourage people to reapply with regional center services if they were earlier denied.
Okay, our last question, and this will lead us probably into some of the training that we're going to be doing next year, is what about conservatorship? Always goes to Steve.
So conservatorship it has an important function. One of the things that concerns us is that for some people, one of the primary ways that people are introduced to conservatorship does happen in transition services when a person turns 18, or the year before the person turns 18, family receives a notice that says that the person at the age of maturity will become an adult, and you need to be invited into those services, into any kind of planning and other kinds of things. Conservatorship is really designed for people who truly cannot meet their needs, even with the supports of the services that exist around them. It is a very important structure, but it needs to be done very thoughtfully, because one of the things that we are seeing is that families are not told the complications that can develop from conservatorship, as well as the other alternatives that exist. And there are lots of things that families can do to support their sons and daughters that don't go through the conservatorship process. And the general guidance and even the legal technicality is that families should first try less restrictive options and explore those and exhaust them before going into a permanent removal of someone's rights that happens within conservatorship. So I would just, it's far too complex to cover right now, but I would let you know that we do have a supported decision-making page on our website that I encourage people to explore those resources, and also to be aware that both the ARC of California and the Center for Excellent Developmental Disabilities are both doing projects right now to inform families about the alternatives to conservatorship and make sure that families have the full picture before they make that decision.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.